It started like most war stories do, with boredom. Boredom and tension, two constant companions aboard the Cathari warship, Fang of Radiance. The ship was a massive, jagged leviathan of metal and purpose, hurtling through the black void toward the next battlefront. For the Cathari, a proud and warlike reptilian species, this was just another deployment in their endless conflict with the Glathi. For me, it was something else entirely. I was a human envoy, sent as an observer, a liaison from Earth. My role was strictly diplomatic, non-combative, and painfully uneventful. The Cathari had agreed to let me stay as part of a larger interstellar alliance, though they clearly didn't think much of me or my kind. To them, humans were soft, weak, and obsessed with sentimental nonsense. Still, they tolerated my presence, though barely. Most of the time, I kept to myself, documenting what I could for my reports back to Earth. But tonight was different. Tonight, I found myself drawn into one of their communal gatherings, a rare moment of camaraderie and humor among the otherwise stoic warriors. The communal chamber was filled with Cathari soldiers lounging around in their angular armor, their scales gleaming under the dim, bluish lighting. They were passing around a holographic display, laughing with the kind of raucous energy that could make even the most hardened diplomat feel out of place. I stood awkwardly at the edge of the room, watching as the hologram projected images from Earth's ancient folklore. Scenes of knights slaying dragons, gods hurling lightning, and monstrous creatures terrorizing villages. They found it hilarious. "Envoy," barked Tarek, an infantry captain with crimson scales and a grin full of sharp teeth. He gestured for me to step closer. "Tell us, is it true that your kind believed in these absurdities?" His voice carried the unmistakable edge of mockery. I hesitated, weighing my options. Human mythology, I began carefully, is a way of explaining the unknown, of teaching lessons through storytelling. It's not meant to be taken literally. Tarek snorted, his tail thumping the floor in amusement. "Not literal, you say? And yet your people told stories of winged beasts breathing fire. You believed sharpened metal could pierce their scales. How quaint." The others erupted into laughter, their tails striking the ground in rhythmic unison. Even Rilke, one of the more reserved soldiers, couldn't hide her amusement. "And those gods of yours," she said, shaking her head. "Immortal beings throwing bolts of energy? Humans must have been terrified of thunder." Their laughter grew louder, a chorus of raspy, guttural sounds that echoed through the chamber. I tried to keep my composure, but their derision was grating. I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could speak, a deep voice cut through the cacophony. "Enough." The room fell silent in an instant. All eyes turned to Commander Vrax, the Cathari war hero, as he stepped into the chamber. He was an imposing figure, even by Cathari standards, his silver scales gleaming like tempered steel, his scarred face a testament to countless battles. Vrax's presence was magnetic. He didn't need to shout or demand attention. It was simply given. He surveyed the room with a measured gaze before his eyes landed on me. "Perhaps," he said, his voice low and steady, "it is time you learned the truth about humans." The soldiers exchanged puzzled glances, their earlier amusement replaced by curiosity. Vrax walked to the center of the chamber and sat down, his movements deliberate, commanding. He gestured for me to sit as well, and I did, though my heart was pounding in my chest. I had no idea what he was about to say, but it was clear that the laughter was over. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the ship's engines reverberating through the walls. All the laughter and mockery had evaporated, replaced by an almost reverent stillness. Commander Vrax leaned forward in his seat, his broad shoulders casting long shadows under the dim light. His piercing silver eyes scanned the room, making sure every soldier was paying attention before he spoke again. Humans, he began, his voice low and deliberate, are not the fragile beings you believe them to be. Nor are their myths as foolish as you think. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Tariq, who moments ago had been leading the charge in ridiculing human legends, seemed especially uncomfortable. His tail, which had slapped the floor in amusement earlier, now curled tightly around his chair. Even Rilke, with her usual sharp wit, was quiet, her amber eyes fixed on the commander. I sat frozen, caught between disbelief and curiosity. Vrax rarely spoke to me directly, let alone defended my species. The Cathari had made it abundantly clear they viewed humanity as insignificant in the grand scale of the galaxy, an amusing, harmless anomaly at best. And yet, here was their most decorated war hero, speaking as if he knew something the others didn't. You mocked their stories of dragons and gods, Vrax continued, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the room. But those tales are echoes of something real, something older than you or I. The humans, in their simplicity, have preserved fragments of a truth we have long forgotten. Tariq, clearly struggling to reconcile his commander's words with his own prejudices, cleared his throat. With respect, Commander, he said cautiously, how can tales of fire-breathing beasts and magical beings hold any truth? They are clearly the creations of an inferior mind grasping at shadows. Vax turned his sharp gaze on Tariq, and the captain immediately stiffened, his confidence wavering under the weight of that stare. Inferior minds? Vax repeated, his voice dropping a degree colder. Let me tell you something, Tariq. The ability to turn terror into story, to weave the incomprehensible into legend, is not a mark of weakness. It is a mark of survival. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. The Cathari soldiers leaned in slightly, drawn in by Vrax's commanding presence. Long before humanity took to the stars, Vrax said, his voice steady but edged with something I couldn't quite place. Admiration, perhaps, or even awe. They faced enemies that would make even the strongest of you tremble. Creatures unlike anything you have encountered, beings that defied reason and sowed devastation wherever they went. Rilke, her curiosity overcoming her usual restraint, spoke up. What kind of enemies, Commander? Vrax paused, his gaze drifting as if recalling something distant and terrible. Predators of fire and shadow, he said finally. They came from the depths of the void, a species whose name has been lost to most. They were conquerors, destroyers of worlds. Entire civilizations were erased by their hunger, reduced to ash and memory. And when these creatures turned their gaze toward Earth, they underestimated humanity. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I'd heard plenty of theories about Earth's ancient past, rumors of forgotten wars and inexplicable ruins. But this was something else entirely. Could Vrax really be telling the truth? Or was this some kind of elaborate ploy to teach his soldiers a lesson? The soldiers, for their part, were transfixed. Even Tariq seemed unable to form a retort, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Vrax's words. They underestimated a species that was not bred for war, but for survival, Vrax continued, his tone sharp. Humans didn't have the strength of the Cathari or the technology of the Glathi, but what they lacked in power they made up for with something far more dangerous, ingenuity. They didn't meet fire with fire, they adapted. They endured. And, against all odds, they won. A ripple of unease passed through the room. The idea of humans defeating such a foe seemed almost impossible, and yet no one dared challenge Vrax directly. But, Commander, Rilke asked carefully, if what you say is true, why have we never heard of these creatures? Why does humanity not speak of them? Vrak's expression darkened, his features hardening. "Perhaps they chose to forget," he said. "Perhaps the memory was too terrible to carry forward. Or perhaps they knew that turning truth into myth was the only way to ensure it would endure." His gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on me. "You mock their myths because you see only weakness. But I see the remnants of a species that has faced horrors we can scarcely imagine, and survived." For the first time since I'd arrived on the Fang of Radiance, I felt a flicker of pride. Maybe Vrax was embellishing, or maybe he wasn't. Either way, his words had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the Kithari soldiers, forcing them to see humanity in a new light. And as Vrax sat back, his story lingering in the air like the echo of distant thunder, I realized something else. This war hero, this battle-hardened Kithari legend, knew more about my species than I did. Vrax's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, like the aftermath of a battle. The soldiers around me shifted uneasily in their seats, their earlier bravado now replaced by a tension they couldn't quite name. I could see it in their faces. The flicker of doubt, the gnawing curiosity. The idea that humans, the species they had always dismissed as weak, could have survived something far more terrifying than the Galathi was almost too much for them to process. "The war I speak of," Vrax began again, his tone slow and deliberate, "was not like the skirmishes you know. It was not fought with fleets or blasters or even the weapons we hold today. It was a war of survival, waged against creatures that defied understanding." He paused, his silver eyes scanning the room, ensuring he had everyone's full attention. "The Othari," he said, the name rolling off his tongue like the hiss of a blade. "That was what they were called. Beings of shadow and flame, conquerors who swept through the galaxy, leaving nothing but ash in their wake." I felt my stomach tighten. The name meant nothing to me. Human history had no record of such creatures. But the way Vrax spoke, the weight behind his words, made it impossible to dismiss. The Kithari soldiers leaned forward, their scales catching the dim light, their curiosity growing despite their attempts to maintain their stoic demeanor. Tarek finally broke the silence, his voice hesitant. "These Othari. What made them so dangerous, Commander? Surely if they were as powerful as you say, no species could have stood against them." Vrax's gaze locked onto Tarek, and the captain stiffened, his tail flicking nervously. "They were dangerous because they were more than physical threats," Vrax replied. "They were terror incarnate. They didn't just destroy their enemies, they broke them. Their presence alone could warp minds, sowing fear and despair before a single blow was struck. They consumed not just worlds, but the will to resist." The room grew colder. Even the hum of the ship seemed muted, as though the vessel itself recoiled at the memory of what Vrax described. I could feel my heart pounding, and I wasn't alone. The Kithari were predators by nature, but the way Vrax spoke of the Othari made it clear that these creatures were something else entirely. Predators of predators. "And yet," Vrax continued, his voice cutting through the silence, "humans resisted. They fought back. They did not have fleets or armies. They had no unified government or advanced weapons, but they had something the Othari could not break: ingenuity, defiance, and a stubborn refusal to die." Rilke, ever the skeptic, tilted her head. "And they won? You expect us to believe that a primitive species triumphed over beings like this?" Vrax leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Victory is not always clean or absolute. The Othari underestimated humanity, and that was their mistake. Humans adapted in ways no one could have predicted. They turned the very nature of the Othari's power against them. They built traps, weapons, and strategies that exploited weaknesses the Othari didn't know they had. And when the dust settled, Earth still stood." The weight of his words pressed down on me. I wanted to argue, to point out that humanity's history held no record of such a war. But a part of me hesitated. What if Vrax was telling the truth? What if those old myths of dragons and demons, of gods battling titanic foes, were echoes of something real, something buried beneath millennia of forgetting? And what became of the Othari? Another soldier asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They were destroyed, Vrax said simply. At least, most of them. Some remnants fled, scattered to the far reaches of the galaxy. I encountered one such remnant many cycles ago, a fractured fleet of Othari that dared to attack a Kithari colony. Even weakened, they were formidable. It took everything we had to defeat them. The room was utterly silent now, the soldiers hanging on Vrax's every word. Even Tariq, who had mocked humanity only minutes ago, looked uneasy, his earlier confidence shattered. Vrax turned his gaze to me, his expression unreadable. The humans of today may not remember the Othari, but their survival is proof enough. They may have buried their past in myths and legends, but the strength that carried them through that war remains in their blood. Never forget that. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The Kithari soldiers were staring at me now, their eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Respect, tinged with fear. It was unnerving, but also strangely empowering. For the first time since arriving aboard the Fang of Radiance, I felt something other than condescension from my hosts. As Vrax sat back, his story complete, the silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken questions. The Kithari had always seen humans as weak, but now that perception had been shaken. And as I sat there, grappling with the possibility that Vrax's tale might be true, one thought echoed in my mind. What else did we not remember about ourselves? The tension in the room lingered long after Vrax finished speaking. The silence wasn't the quiet of boredom or awkwardness. It was the heavy, contemplative quiet of warriors who had been forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The Kithari weren't used to this. They thrived on certainty, on the clear, undeniable superiority of their own kind in battle. But now that certainty was crumbling, and I could see it in their eyes. Tariq, who had been the loudest voice of mockery earlier, finally spoke, though his usual arrogance had been replaced with hesitation. "Commander," he said, his tail curling around his leg as if for comfort, "if the humans defeated these Othari, then why don't they remember? How could they forget a war like that? No species forgets a victory of that magnitude." Vrax's silver gaze shifted to Tariq, his expression unreadable. "Because forgetting is sometimes a survival tactic," he said. "Humans may have won, but not without cost. Their victory was not a clean triumph. It came with destruction, with loss so great it threatened their very identity. Sometimes, the only way to move forward is to bury the pain, to turn it into something that can be understood. Stories, myths, legends, they chose to remember in a way that wouldn't break them." Rilke leaned forward, her amber eyes narrowed in thought. "But the way you speak of it, Commander, it wasn't just humanity that suffered. You said you encountered remnants of the Othari. If they were so powerful, why did they flee? What made them crumble?" Vrax let out a slow breath, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing something none of us could. "The Othari weren't invincible," he said. "They thrived on fear, on the psychological devastation they caused. They were creatures of dominance, used to breaking their prey before ever striking a blow. But humanity did something no species had ever done before. They refused to give in. They faced the Othari's terror and fought through it, adapting to their tactics and turning their fear into fire." He paused, his claws tapping lightly on the armrest of his seat. "And in doing so, they revealed something the Othari had never known: fragility. For the first time, the Othari realized they could lose. It broke them as much as humanity's weapons did." I listened in stunned silence, my mind racing. If any of this was true, it was unlike anything I'd ever learned about human history. Our greatest achievements had always been framed as products of ingenuity and resilience, yes, but this was something else entirely. It was a picture of humanity not just as survivors, but as conquerors of something unspeakable. And yet, we had chosen to forget. One of the younger soldiers, his green scales still bright with youth, raised a hesitant claw. "But, Commander," he asked, his voice trembling slightly, "what does this mean for us? If humans could defeat such a foe, what does that make them now?" Vrax's gaze turned to me, and for the first time his expression softened, not with pity, but with something closer to understanding. "It makes them a species to respect," he said simply, "and one to fear if ever provoked." The weight of his words settled heavily on my shoulders. I had always been aware of humanity's precarious position in the galactic stage. A newcomer, small and insignificant compared to the elder species that had dominated for millennia. And yet, here was Vrax, one of the galaxy's most feared warriors, telling his soldiers that humanity was more dangerous than they realized. Tariq, still clearly struggling with the implications, shook his head. "Even if that's true," he said, his voice tinged with defiance, "humans today are nothing like the ones you describe. They've grown soft, reliant on alliances and diplomacy. Whatever strength they once had is gone." Vrax's eyes narrowed, and his voice turned sharp. "Do not mistake civility for weakness, Tariq. Humans do not display their claws unless forced. That is their way. It always has been. They adapt to the times, to the threats they face. And if the need arises, they will remember the fire that forged them. Make no mistake, they still carry it, even if it lies dormant." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Their earlier confidence in their superiority shattered. I could see the gears turning in their minds, the slow realization that the species they had dismissed as insignificant might be far more formidable than they'd ever imagined. Rex stood, his towering form casting long shadows across the room. "Remember this conversation," he said, his voice firm. "The galaxy is vast and its history is longer than any of us can comprehend. What humanity endured and overcame is a testament to their will. Mock their myths if you wish, but do not underestimate what lies beneath them. You will not survive the mistake." With that, he turned and left the chamber, his heavy footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. The soldiers sat frozen, their thoughts clearly spinning in 1,000 directions. I remained in my seat, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask. The Cathari had always treated humanity as an amusing curiosity, something to be tolerated but not truly taken seriously. Now, that perception had been irrevocably altered. And for me, the envoy from Earth, the weight of what I'd just heard was almost too much to bear. What had we forgotten? What truths lay hidden beneath the myths we told ourselves? And if those truths ever surfaced again, would we be ready? After Vox left, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. It only deepened, sinking into the bones of everyone present. The soldiers were quiet, a stark contrast to the mocking laughter that had filled the space not long ago. They exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable, but the discomfort was evident in the way their tails flicked, their claws tapped, their bodies shifted restlessly in their seats. For a moment, I didn't dare move. It felt as though the weight of Vrax's words had pinned me in place. His gaze, as he spoke about humanity's dormant strength, still lingered in my mind, sharp and unrelenting. I wasn't sure what disturbed me more, the idea that he might be exaggerating or the possibility that he wasn't. Rilke finally broke the silence, her voice low and cautious. "If what the commander says is true," she began, her sharp eyes darting toward me, "then why are humans as they are now? You don't act like a species forged in war. You act like children playing among giants." Her words stung, but I couldn't blame her for the comparison. Humans were new to the galactic stage, and despite our rapid technological advancements and growing alliances, we were still seen as naive and harmless by most species. I didn't have an answer for her, not one I was confident in, so I stayed silent. Tariq, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet since Vrock's departure, finally spoke up, his tone sharper than before. "Perhaps the commander sees something that isn't there," he said, his tail curling tightly around his chair. "Perhaps humans got lucky against these Othari, a fluke of circumstance, not strength. It would explain why they've amounted to so little since—" The room stirred with murmurs of agreement, but it was half-hearted, as though the soldiers were trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. Tariq's words might have resonated with them moments ago, but Vrax's story had shaken their confidence too deeply to be undone so easily. "I don't think it's luck," Rilke said, cutting through the murmurs. Her gaze was still fixed on me, unblinking. "Luck doesn't explain what the commander described, and it doesn't explain why humanity's myths, your myths, feel so—" I frowned, startled by her shift in tone. "Familiar?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. The way the commander spoke about the Othari, it reminded me of something. Old Kithari stories long before the Unification Wars, tales of shadowed predators and fire that devoured the sky. We dismissed them as fables, of course, but the way he described it, I wonder if those were echoes of the same war. Her words sent a chill down my spine. If what she was saying was true, then the war against the Othari wasn't just a human secret. It was a galaxy-wide memory, buried and distorted by time. Tariq snorted, but it lacked his usual conviction. Ancient stories are just that. Stories. If there were such a war, the galaxy would remember. Civilizations don't forget annihilation. Don't they? Rilke shot back, her voice sharper now. How many empires have risen and fallen, their histories lost to the void? How many wars have been erased because no one survived to tell the tale? If the Othari were as terrible as the commander described, then maybe forgetting was the only way to move forward. The room fell silent again, her words striking a chord that none of them wanted to admit. I could feel their gazes drifting toward me, their curiosity mingled with unease. To them, I wasn't just an envoy anymore. I was a reminder of the uncertainty Vrax had planted in their minds, a walking question mark. Finally, one of the younger soldiers spoke, his voice hesitant but filled with genuine curiosity. "Do humans remember anything? Even fragments? Stories passed down that might explain the truth?" I hesitated, the weight of their attention pressing down on me. "We have myths," I said carefully. "Legends of gods and monsters, of wars between light and darkness, but they've always been seen as metaphorical, cultural, not historical." "Perhaps they aren't just metaphors," Rilke said quietly. "Perhaps they're your truth hidden in plain sight." Tariq growled softly, his frustration breaking through. "Enough speculation. If humans truly carry this supposed strength, then why don't we see it? Why don't they act like the warriors the commander described?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Rilke beat me to it. "Because warriors don't always look like warriors," she said, her voice firm. "Sometimes strength isn't in how you fight, but in how you endure. And maybe humans have been enduring, waiting for the moment they're forced to remember." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. The Kithari soldiers were grappling with a concept they had never considered, that humanity's perceived weakness might be a facade, a mask over something far more dangerous. I didn't know whether to feel proud or terrified. If what Vrax and Rilke said was true, then humanity's greatest weapon wasn't its technology or alliances. It was its ability to survive, to adapt, to endure, and that made us unpredictable. As the soldiers slowly dispersed, their expressions a mix of doubt and unease, I remained in my seat, lost in thought. Vrax's words had shaken them, but they'd shaken me even more. What had humanity truly forgotten? And if the time came to remember, what would we find waiting in the shadows of our myths? I couldn't sleep that night. The weight of Vrax's story and the uneasy stares of the Cathari soldiers lingered with me long after I left the chamber. The barracks were quieter than usual, the typical hum of alien camaraderie replaced with a strange and uneasy silence. Even the Cathari, known for their confidence and pride, seemed to tread lightly in the hallways. It was as though Vrax's words had left a crack in their collective perception of the galaxy, and they didn't know what might spill out. For me, the story had opened a door I couldn't close. I sat on the edge of the cot in my assigned quarters, staring out at the stars beyond the viewport. They looked different tonight, more distant somehow. I thought of Earth, of the myths that had been woven into the fabric of our culture. Dragons, demons, gods, titanic wars between light and darkness. Every culture had them, stories of unimaginable conflict and victory against impossible odds. They had always been stories, or so I'd thought. What if they weren't? A knock at the door broke my reverie, and I turned to see Rilke standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her amber eyes glinted in the dim light, and the normally confident set of her shoulders was softened, almost hesitant. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, motioning for her to enter. She stepped inside, her movements quieter than usual, her claws clicking softly against the floor. For a moment, she didn't speak, her gaze fixed on the stars outside. Then she let out a slow breath and turned to face me. "Your commander," she began, her tone cautious. "He spoke of humanity's strength as if it's something hidden, dormant. I've been thinking about that." "So how has everyone else?" I replied, managing a faint, wry smile. "I've been feeling their stares all night." "They don't know what to make of you," she said bluntly. "None of us do. You're not what we expected. And after hearing Vrax, well, you're more of a mystery now than ever." I let out a dry laugh. "A mystery to you? Imagine how it feels to me. I grew up on those myths he talked about, and I never thought they were anything more than stories. Now I'm wondering if my ancestors were fighting gods, while we thought they were chasing shadows." Rilke tilted her head, studying me. "If they were," she said carefully, "then it means something about you is different. It's not just about what your ancestors did, it's about what they left behind. If humanity was forged in the fire of that war, as Vrax says, then you're the result of that forging. It's in your blood." Her words sent a chill through me. "You think there's some kind of legacy in us? Some forgotten strength we don't even know we have?" She nodded slowly. "Perhaps. The commander wouldn't have said what he did if he didn't believe it. And Vrax is not a being given to empty words." I frowned, struggling to reconcile her theory with everything I knew, or thought I knew, about humanity. "Even if that's true," I said, "what does it matter? We don't remember. Whatever strength we had, it's buried under thousands of years of forgetting. We're not the people he described anymore." "Maybe you don't need to be," Rilke said, her voice soft but insistent. "Maybe it's not about remembering the specifics. Maybe it's about knowing it's there, waiting to surface when it's needed." I didn't know how to respond. The idea that humanity carried some kind of latent strength, some ancient power forged in a forgotten war, was almost too much to comprehend. But at the same time, it felt right, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. I thought of the stories my grandparents had told me when I was young, of heroes and monsters, of battles that shaped the world. They'd always felt larger than life, but now they felt eerily real. "What do you think happened to them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The Othari, if they were as powerful as Vrax said, why didn't they come back?" Rilke's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Perhaps they did," she said. "Or perhaps they were too broken to rise again. But if they still exist, somewhere in the galaxy, then the commander's warning is clear. If they return, you humans may be the only ones who can stop them again." The weight of her words settled heavily on my chest. The idea that humanity might once again face a threat like the Othari was terrifying, but what frightened me more was the possibility that we wouldn't be ready, that we wouldn't remember how to fight. Rilke stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You're more than you think you are," she said. "And so are your people. Vrax sees it. I'm starting to see it. Maybe it's time you saw it, too." I looked at her, uncertain but grateful. She was right. About Vrax, about the myths, about the legacy that might be buried within us. If what Vrax had said was true, then humanity wasn't just a species of survivors. We were something more, something that had been forged in a crucible of unimaginable terror. And if the time came to remember, I could only hope we'd be ready to embrace what lay hidden in our blood. The next morning came with an odd stillness, as though the weight of Vrax's words still pressed down on the Cathari soldiers. The usual bustle and loud banter in the barracks were muted. Even Tarek, who had mocked humanity so openly the day before, now kept to himself, his usual arrogance replaced with a subdued, contemplative demeanor. I wasn't sure if it was fear or uncertainty that kept him quiet, but whatever it wasn't unique to him. It lingered in the air like a shadow. I spent most of the morning in solitude, trying to process everything that had happened. Vrax's story, Rilke's words, the myths I had grown up with. They all felt like pieces of a puzzle I had no idea how to assemble. What was the truth about humanity's past? Had we really fought and defeated a foe so terrible it had left scars across the galaxy? And if so, why had we forgotten? More importantly, what would it mean if we ever remembered? By midday, Vrax called for a meeting in the strategy hall. The soldiers filed in one by one, their usual confident postures subdued, their eyes filled with questions they weren't ready to voice. I followed behind, unsure of my place in all of this. I wasn't one of them, not really. I was an envoy, a diplomat, an observer, but now I felt like something more, an unwilling symbol of the uncertainty that had been stirred in their hearts. Breck stood at the front of the hall, his imposing figure casting long shadows across the room. His silver eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment, I thought they lingered on me. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority that commanded respect. "We have spoken of myths," he began, his tone measured, "of stories that some of you dismissed as foolishness. But let me tell you this. Myths are not born of nothing. They are echoes of truths that civilizations have chosen, or been forced, to forget. Humanity's myths are no different." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was deathly silent, every Cathari soldier hanging on his every word. Even Tariq, who had challenged him so openly before, was watching intently. "The war against the Othari was real," Vrax continued. "I have seen the evidence with my own eyes. I have walked through the ruins of their destruction and heard the whispers of those who survived. And I tell you now, humanity is not to be underestimated. They carry within them a strength that lies dormant, but it is there. If provoked, it will rise again."